I never thought something like this could happen in my family. But one day, my stepson asked me to do something that turned my entire life upside down. My name is Amanda. I'm 37, a second-time newlywed, and for the most part, I've always thought of myself as someone who has everything under control. My husband, Mark, is a kind and hardworking man, and when I married him, I knew I'd be stepping into the role of stepmother to his son, Jack. Jack was 21 when he moved back in with us after college. He was confident, charismatic, and had a way of making people laugh without even trying. He wasn't the type to openly share his emotions, but he was likable, even charming, in a way that made everyone around him gravitate toward him. From the beginning, I tried to be more of a friend to Jack than a strict parental figure. After all, I was barely 16 years older than him, and the idea of being a stepmom felt strange. But despite my efforts to build a connection, our relationship remained surface level. Pleasant, polite, but distant. At least, that's how it was until a few weeks ago. It all started one quiet afternoon. Mark was at work, and I was home, sorting through some old clothes in the guest room. I'd just finished folding the last pile when I heard the front door open and close. "Jack?" I called out. "Yeah, it's me," he replied, his voice casual, but distant. I walked out to see him in the hallway, heading toward his room. "Hey," I said, trying to strike up a conversation. "How was your day?" "It was fine," he said, shrugging, and then he disappeared into his room, shutting the door behind him. I stood there for a moment, wondering if I'd done something wrong. Jack wasn't usually this cold, but I shrugged it off and went about my day. Later that evening, as I was tidying up in the living room, I noticed something odd. Jack's laptop was on the coffee table, open but asleep. Normally, he was attached to that thing, and he never left it lying around. Curiosity got the better of me. I told myself I was just going to close it and put it away, but when I picked it up, the screen lit up, and my stomach dropped. There, on the screen, was a photo of me. One I recognized immediately. It was from last summer, a candid shot Mark had taken of me at the beach. I was wearing a sundress, laughing, my hair caught in the breeze. It was a completely innocent photo, but seeing it here, on Jack's laptop, felt anything but. I set the laptop down as quickly as I'd picked it up, my heart pounding. The next morning, I couldn't shake the image from my mind. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that maybe Jack had saved the photo for some innocent reason. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. At breakfast, Jack seemed his usual self, but I couldn't look at him without feeling a knot in my stomach. I avoided eye contact, kept the conversation light, and told myself I was overthinking. But things didn't stop there. A few days later, I walked past Jack's room and noticed the door was slightly ajar. I wasn't planning to stop, but something caught my eye. He was sitting on the edge of his bed, holding something in his hands, a piece of fabric. It took me a moment to realize it was one of my scarves. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, unsure of what to do. Jack hadn't noticed me, so I quietly backed away and went to my room, my mind racing. Why did he have my scarf? Was it just a coincidence? Or was there something else going on? I didn't know what to think, but I couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest. The tension between us only grew after that. Jack started finding excuses to be around me, helping with chores, lingering in the kitchen while I cooked, making small talk that felt just a little too personal. One evening, while we were washing dishes together, he turned to me and said, "You know, you don't act like most stepmoms." I laughed nervously. "Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" "It's a good thing," he said, his tone serious. "You're different." "In a good way." I didn't know how to respond, so I just smiled and changed the subject. But his words stuck with me, replaying in my mind long after I went to bed that night. And then came the moment that changed everything. It was late one evening, and Mark had gone to bed early. I was in the kitchen, putting away the last of the dishes, when Jack walked in. He leaned against the counter, watching me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. "Can I ask you something?" he said, his voice low. Of course, I said, trying to sound casual. He hesitated for a moment, then said, if I asked you to. I don't know, do something crazy, would you? I frowned, confused. What kind of crazy? Like, something just between us, he said, his eyes locking onto mine. The air between us felt heavy, charged with something I didn't understand, or maybe didn't want to understand. Jack, what are you talking about? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He stepped closer, his expression unreadable. I want to see you, he said, his voice steady. Without anything. Just you. I stared at him, my mind reeling. I wanted to believe I'd misheard him, that this was some kind of joke. But the look in his eyes told me otherwise. Jack, I said, my voice trembling. This isn't funny. I'm not joking, he said softly. I've thought about this for a long time, Amanda. I know it's crazy, but I also know you've thought about it too. I took a step back, my heart pounding. You need to stop, I said firmly. This isn't okay. But as I turned to leave, his words stopped me in my tracks. You're not saying no, he said, his voice calm, but certain. That's all I needed to know. That was the moment I realized my life would never be the same. And if you think this was bad, trust me, it gets worse. Much worse. It started subtly at first. Jack began to pull away from his father. Conversations between them grew shorter, more strained, and he started spending more time in his room or out of the house. Mark didn't seem to notice, chalking it up to Jack's moodiness or stress. But with me? Jack was different. He was around me more often, always finding an excuse to linger when we were alone. His comments, once casual and light-hearted, started to feel layered with meaning. You always look so put together, he said one evening while I was folding laundry in the living room. Mark's lucky to have you. Thank you, I replied, laughing awkwardly. I try. You don't even have to try, he added, his eyes lingering on me just a moment too long before turning back to his phone. At first, I brushed it off. Jack had always been charming, and I told myself I was overthinking. But then, the little moments started to add up. One afternoon, I came home earlier than expected. Mark was still at work, and the house was unusually quiet. I set my bag down and headed upstairs, to check on Jack. His door was closed, but it wasn't latched, and as I passed by, I noticed something through the small gap. Jack was sitting on his bed, holding something in his hands. It wasn't until I stepped closer that I realized what it was, a dress of mine. My heart stopped. It wasn't a dress I wore often, just something I had tossed into the laundry a few days ago. But seeing it in his hands, the way he was holding it, sent a chill through me. For a moment, I considered walking away, pretending I hadn't seen anything. But before I could make a decision, the floor creaked under my foot. Jack's head snapped up, and his eyes locked onto mine. Amanda, he said, startled. What are you doing? I asked, my voice unsteady. He looked down at the dress, then back at me. It's not what it looks like, he said quickly. Then what is it? I asked, stepping into the room, my pulse racing. I was just grabbing it to bring it back to you, he said, holding it out as if to prove his point. I found it mixed in with some of my stuff. His explanation didn't make sense. The dress had been in the laundry, nowhere near his things. But I didn't press him on it. I just took the dress from his hands, my fingers brushing against his as I did. His eyes didn't waver. There was something in them, something intense, almost desperate. Thanks, I said awkwardly, stepping back toward the door. Just, let me know next time, okay? He nodded, but his expression didn't change. Of course, he said, his voice steady. I left the room quickly, closing the door behind me. My hands were trembling as I clutched the dress. My mind was racing with questions I didn't want to answer. From that day on, things felt different between us. Jack's demeanor around me grew bolder. He wasn't overt, but the way he spoke, the way he looked at me, carried an undercurrent that I couldn't ignore. One evening, while Mark was watching a game in the den, Jack and I ended up in the kitchen together. I was chopping vegetables for dinner when he leaned against the counter, watching me. "You're good at this," he said, his tone casual, but his eyes focused on me. "Good at what?" I asked, not looking up. "Being perfect," he said, his voice softer now. I paused, my knife hovering over the cutting board. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you're everything anyone could ever want," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. I turned to look at him, unsure of what to say. His expression was calm, but his eyes were piercing, searching mine for something I didn't want to give. "Jack," I began, but before I could finish, Mark called from the other room. "Dinner almost ready?" The moment broke, and Jack smiled, stepping back. "I'll grab the plates," he said, his tone light again. But the look he gave me as he turned away lingered in my mind for the rest of the night. I told myself I was imagining things, that Jack's behavior was just a phase. But deep down, I knew better. There was something in the way he spoke to me, the way he looked at me, that felt deliberate. And as much as I tried to ignore it, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. And, as it turned out, I was right. It wasn't over, not even close. Jack's behavior grew bolder with each passing day. At first, it was subtle, comments that could easily be brushed off as playful or harmless. But as time went on, his words became harder to ignore, his intentions less ambiguous. One afternoon, we found ourselves alone in the living room. Mark had gone out to run errands, leaving the house quiet and still. I was reading a book, trying to enjoy the silence, when Jack walked in and sat down on the couch across from me. "What are you reading?" he asked, his voice casual. "Just a novel," I replied, not looking up. "Anything interesting?" he pressed, leaning forward slightly. "Not really," I said, turning a page. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then, out of nowhere, he said, "You know, you're different from other women." I looked up, startled. "What's that supposed to mean?" He shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. "You just carry yourself differently. There's something about you that's hard to explain." "Well, thank you, I guess," I said, laughing nervously. "It's a compliment," he said, his gaze steady. "You should take it." The moments like that started to pile up. Jack found excuses to be near me whenever Mark wasn't around. He'd linger in the kitchen while I cooked, offer to help with household chores, even sit beside me on the couch during movie nights. And every time, there was something in his eyes, a look that made my stomach twist in ways I couldn't quite understand, or maybe didn't want to. One evening, while we were cleaning up after dinner, he reached for a dish, just as I did. Our hands brushed, and I pulled back quickly, trying to ignore the way my heart skipped a beat. "Sorry," I muttered, focusing on the sink. "No need to apologize," he said, his voice low. "It's just us, after all." The way he said it made me pause. I turned to look at him, but he was already walking out of the kitchen, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I tried to avoid him after that, making excuses to stay busy or be out of the house when I knew he'd be around. But Jack was persistent. He always seemed to find a way to corner me, to pull me into conversations that left me feeling flustered and unsure. One night, I was sitting in the backyard, enjoying the cool evening air, when he came out and sat beside me. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. "Not at all," I said, though my chest tightened as I said it. We sat in silence for a while, the only sound the faint chirping of crickets. Then, out of nowhere, he said, "Do you ever think about how things could have been different?" I frowned, confused. "Different how?" "If we'd met in another way," he said, his voice soft. "If you weren't married to my dad." "Jack," I began, my voice firm. "That's not something you should be thinking about." "Why not?" he asked, turning to look at me. "It's not like I can control how I feel." His words left me speechless. I stared at him, my mind racing. "I know it's wrong," he continued, his voice steady. "But I can't help it." You've always been more than just a stepmom to me. I stood up abruptly, my heart pounding. I think it's time we went inside, I said, my voice trembling. He didn't argue, but the look in his eyes as he followed me inside told me this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Over the next few days, I tried to put as much distance between us as possible. But no matter how hard I tried, Jack always seemed to find a way to be near me. His comments became more direct, his actions more deliberate, and the more I resisted, the more persistent he became. And the worst part? A small, treacherous part of me didn't hate the attention. It was flattering, in a way I didn't want to admit. But it also terrified me. Because deep down, I knew this was heading somewhere I couldn't come back from. Jack's persistence only grew stronger, leaving me caught in a web of confusion and guilt. He found ways to insert himself into my daily routine, always helpful, always kind, but with an undercurrent of something unspoken that I couldn't ignore. One morning, as I was rushing to leave for an errand, I couldn't find my keys. After tearing through the house in frustration, Jack appeared at the doorway, holding them up with a small smile. "Looking for these?" he asked, dangling them in the air. "Yes," I said, trying to sound composed. "Where did you find them?" "They were on the kitchen counter," he replied, stepping closer. "You're always so busy, Amanda. You need someone to help you out." "I can manage," I said, reaching for the keys. But instead of handing them over, he hesitated, holding them just out of reach. His eyes locked onto mine, his expression unreadable. "You shouldn't have to," he said softly. I didn't know how to respond, so I grabbed the keys and left, my pulse racing. It wasn't just small gestures. Jack's words carried weight now, carefully chosen to linger in my mind long after he said them. Compliments that should have been harmless felt like they carried hidden meaning. "That dress looks amazing on you," he said one evening as I walked past him in the hallway. "You have a way of making everything look effortless." "Thanks," I replied, avoiding his gaze. He stepped closer, leaning casually against the wall. "I mean it. You're beautiful, Amanda." His words stopped me in my tracks. I turned to look at him, unsure of what to say. The intensity in his eyes was unnerving, but there was something else, something that made my stomach twist in ways I didn't want to admit. "Jack," I began, but he interrupted me. "I know what you're going to say," he said, his voice calm. "That I shouldn't say things like that." "But why not? It's the truth." A few days later, I found a small box on the kitchen counter with my name on it. Inside was a delicate necklace, simple, but beautiful. I stared at it for a long moment, unsure of what to make of it. When Jack walked in, he saw me holding the box and smiled. "You like it?" he asked, his tone casual. "Jack, what is this?" I asked, holding up the necklace. "A gift," he said, leaning against the counter. "I saw it and thought of you." "You can't just do things like this," I said, shaking my head. "Why not?" he asked, his smile fading. "You deserve nice things, Amanda. I wanted you to have it." "It's inappropriate," I said firmly, putting the necklace back in the box. But even as I said the words, I felt a pang of guilt. Not because I didn't like the gift, but because a part of me did. The tension between us reached a breaking point one evening. Mark was working late, and Jack and I were alone in the house. I was in the living room, trying to read, when Jack walked in and sat down across from me. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice serious. I sighed, setting my book aside. "What's on your mind?" He hesitated for a moment, then said, "I need to know something." "Okay," I said cautiously. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Do you ever think about me?" The question caught me off guard. "Of course I think about you," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "You're my stepson." "That's not what I mean," he said, his eyes searching mine. "I mean, do you think about me the way I think about you?" "Jack," I said, my voice firm. "This needs to stop. Whatever you're feeling, it's not. It's not wrong, he interrupted, his voice rising slightly. I know you feel it too, Amanda. I see the way you look at me. I stood up, shaking my head. This conversation is over. But before I could walk away, he said something that stopped me in my tracks. Just one time, he said softly. Let me see you. Just you. No one else has to know. It'll be our secret. I turned to face him, my heart pounding. Jack, do you even hear yourself? This is insane. It's not insane, he said, standing up and stepping closer. It's honest. And I know you've thought about it too. I didn't know what to say. My mind was spinning, my emotions a whirlwind of anger, confusion, and something else I didn't want to name. Go to your room, I said finally, my voice trembling. For a moment, he didn't move. But then he nodded, a small smile playing on his lips as he walked past me. You'll think about it, he said as he left the room. I stood there for a long time after he was gone, my thoughts racing. He was wrong. He had to be wrong. But deep down, I wasn't sure if he was. It was a quiet evening, the kind where the silence in the house felt heavier than usual. Mark had called earlier to say he'd be working late, leaving just Jack and me alone. I'd spent the day trying to stay busy, keeping as much distance between us as possible, but by nightfall, the weight of everything was impossible to ignore. I was in the kitchen, washing the last of the dishes, when I heard his footsteps behind me. I didn't turn around, hoping he'd sense my unease and leave me alone. But he didn't. Amanda, he said softly, his voice carrying a calm determination. I froze for a moment before turning to face him. What is it, Jack? We need to talk, he said, stepping closer. We've talked enough, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Whatever this is, it has to stop. He shook his head, a small smile playing on his lips. You don't mean that. I do, I said firmly, though the tremble in my hands betrayed me. He stepped even closer, his eyes locking onto mine. Then why can't you look at me without blushing? Why do you get so nervous every time we're alone? Jack, enough, I said, my voice rising. But he didn't stop. You're not afraid of what I'll do, he said softly. You're afraid of what you want to do. His words hit me like a punch to the chest. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but I couldn't. Because deep down, a part of me knew he was right. Jack, this is wrong, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Maybe it is, he said, his gaze unwavering. But it doesn't change how I feel. And it doesn't change how you feel either. I turned away, gripping the edge of the counter as if it could anchor me. You don't know what you're talking about. I know exactly what I'm talking about, he said, his voice steady. And so do you. I felt his presence behind me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his body. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. You don't have to fight this, he said, his voice soft but insistent. Just once. That's all I'm asking. I turned to face him, my chest tight with a mix of emotions I couldn't untangle. And then what? I asked, my voice trembling. Then we figure it out, he said. Together. I wanted to tell him no, to end this once and for all, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stood there, frozen, as he reached for my hand. What happened next was a blur. A mix of emotions, sensations, and decisions that felt like they weren't entirely my own. For a brief, fleeting moment, I let myself get lost in it, forgetting everything else, Mark, the consequences, the reality of what we were doing. But as soon as it was over, reality came crashing back in. I pulled away from him, my chest heaving, my mind racing. What have I done? I whispered, my voice breaking. Amanda, he began, reaching for me. Don't, I said sharply, stepping back. Don't touch me. His expression shifted, a mix of confusion and hurt. You wanted this, he said softly. No, I said, shaking my head. This was a mistake. A terrible, terrible mistake. I turned and left the room, my legs shaking as I climbed the stairs to my bedroom. Once inside, I closed the door and sank to the floor, burying my face in my hands. Tears streamed down my face as the weight of what I'd done settled over me. I hated myself in that moment, hated my weakness, my inability to say no, my willingness to throw everything away for, what? I couldn't answer that question. And I wasn't sure I ever would. The house felt different after that night. Every time I saw Jack, I was reminded of what had happened, and the guilt was suffocating. I avoided him as much as possible, but it was impossible to escape the reality of what we'd done. And as much as I wanted to pretend otherwise, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. After that night, everything changed. The air in the house felt heavy, charged with unspoken tension. I avoided Jack as much as possible, keeping to myself and throwing myself into housework or errands. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that his eyes were always on me. He didn't make it easy. Jack wasn't apologetic or distant, he was bold, more confident than ever. It was as if crossing that line had only made him more determined. One afternoon, I was folding laundry in the living room when Jack walked in and sat down on the couch across from me. I didn't look up, hoping he'd take the hint and leave. "We need to talk," he said, his voice calm but firm. "There's nothing to talk about," I replied, keeping my focus on the clothes. "Don't do that," he said, leaning forward. "Don't act like nothing happened." "Jack, please," I said, my voice trembling. "We can't do this." "Why not?" he asked, his tone growing sharper. "Because you're scared? Because you think it's wrong? We both know that's not how you really feel." I stood up, clutching a pile of clothes to my chest like a shield. "You need to stop," I said, my voice breaking. "This was a mistake, and it can't happen again." But he didn't back down. He stood too, his eyes locking onto mine. "It wasn't a mistake, Amanda. You know that as well as I do. You felt it too." "No," I said, shaking my head. "I didn't." "Yes, you did," he said, stepping closer. "And you still do. You're just too afraid to admit it." His words left me speechless. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him he was wrong, but I couldn't. Because deep down, a part of me knew he wasn't. Jack's persistence only grew stronger. He found ways to corner me, to remind me of what had happened and what he believed we could have. "You and Mark," he said one evening as I was cleaning up in the kitchen. "You don't have what we have. You can't tell me it's the same." "Don't bring him into this," I snapped, my hands trembling as I scrubbed the counter. "Why not?" he asked, leaning against the doorway. "It's the truth. You're not happy with him, Amanda. You haven't been for a long time. I'm just the one who finally showed you there's something better." I spun around, glaring at him. "You don't know what you're talking about," I said. "I know exactly what I'm talking about," he replied, his tone steady. "And so do you. You just don't want to admit it." The breaking point came a few days later. Mark had been acting strange, quieter, more distant. I thought it was just work stress, but then he said something that stopped me in my tracks. "Is everything okay with you and Jack?" he asked casually over dinner. My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't know," he said, shrugging. "You two seem different lately." "Closer." "We're fine," I said quickly. "He's just been helping out more around the house." Mark didn't look convinced. He nodded but kept his eyes on me, and I felt like he could see right through me. Later that night, I sat alone in my bedroom, my thoughts racing. Mark's words had shaken me, but they also brought a terrifying realization: he was starting to suspect something. I couldn't let this go on. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. But every time I thought about confronting Jack, about putting an end to it once and for all, I felt paralyzed. Because the truth was, a part of me didn't want it to end. And that was the most terrifying thing of all. Jack found me sitting on the edge of my bed, staring blankly at the floor. He knocked softly on the door before stepping inside. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. "No," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not." He walked over and sat down beside me, his presence both comforting and suffocating. "What's wrong?" he asked. "Mark," I said, my voice trembling. "He knows something's off. He's starting to suspect." Jack didn't look surprised. Instead, he reached for my hand, his touch warm and steady. "We'll figure it out," he said. "There's nothing to figure out," I said, pulling my hand away. "This has to stop, Jack." "It has to." He shook his head, his expression resolute. "You don't mean that." "Yes, I do," I said, tears streaming down my face. "This has gone too far. We've gone too far." But Jack didn't back down. "We're meant to be together, Amanda. You know that as well as I do. Mark will never understand you the way I do." His words sent a chill through me, and for the first time, I realized just how far he was willing to go. And in that moment, I knew that things were about to get even worse. The weight of the secret had become unbearable. Every interaction with Mark felt like a lie, and every glance from Jack was a reminder of how deeply I had betrayed the man who trusted me the most. I couldn't live like this anymore. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when everything was falling apart. That night, after dinner, I sat down with Mark in the living room. He was scrolling through his phone, relaxed and unsuspecting. My hands were shaking as I placed a glass of water on the table and sat across from him. "Mark," I began, my voice trembling, "I need to tell you something." He looked up, his brow furrowing. "What is it?" he asked, setting his phone down. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. "It's about Jack," I said finally. The change in his expression was immediate. He sat up straighter, his jaw tightening. "What about him?" I took a deep breath, willing myself to continue. "Something happened," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Something that never should have happened." Mark stared at me, his eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about, Amanda?" he demanded. Tears filled my eyes as I forced the words out. "Jack and we crossed a line. It was a mistake. A terrible mistake, and I'm so sorry." For a moment, there was silence. Then Mark stood abruptly, his face a mask of disbelief and anger. "What are you saying?" he asked, his voice rising. "What the hell are you saying?" "I'm sorry," I repeated, my voice breaking. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I never wanted this." His face turned red with rage. "You didn't mean for it to happen?" he shouted. "You didn't want this? Then why the hell did it happen, Amanda? How could you do this to me? To us?" "I don't know," I said, sobbing. "I wasn't thinking. I was stupid, and I made a mistake." Mark turned away, running his hands through his hair. "Where is he?" he asked sharply. "Where's Jack?" "Mark, please," I said, standing. "Don't do this. Don't make it worse." But he was already heading for the stairs. I followed him, my heart racing as he stormed into Jack's room. Jack was sitting on his bed, his headphones on, but when he saw Mark, he stood quickly. "What's going on?" Jack asked, his voice calm but wary. "You know damn well what's going on," Mark shouted, his voice shaking with fury. "How could you do this? How could you do this to me?" Jack's expression shifted, but he didn't deny it. Instead, he said, "It's not what you think, Dad. Don't you dare try to justify this." Mark yelled. "Pack your things. You're leaving. Tonight." "Mark, please," I begged, stepping between them. "Don't do this." But Mark turned to me, his eyes filled with betrayal. "You don't get to ask me for anything," he said coldly. "You've already taken everything." Jack left that night, his suitcase in hand and his face unreadable. Mark didn't speak to me again. He spent the next few days packing his own things, and when he finally left, he didn't even say goodbye. I was alone. Completely, utterly alone. The silence in the house was deafening, a constant reminder of everything I'd lost. I tried to keep myself busy, but no matter what I did, I couldn't escape the guilt, the regret, the crushing weight of my own mistakes. I sat in the living room one night, staring at the empty couch where Mark used to sit, where Jack used to laugh and joke. Tears streamed down my face as I whispered to myself, I wanted to take it all back. But now, it's too late. I've destroyed everything I loved. And that's where it ends. That's the truth of what happened. But I have to ask, what would you have done? Could you have stopped it before it went too far? Let me know in the comments. I want to hear your thoughts.